History is filled with long wars, years of fighting, endless campaigns, names carved into memorials and monuments. But in the late morning hours of August 27, 1896, war came and went before the dust had time to settle. A war that lasted just 38 minutes, the shortest in human history. A war born from ambition, empire, arrogance, and a ticking clock. This is the story of the Anglo-Zanzibar War. To understand how a war could begin and end in less time than it takes to boil an egg twice, we must first linger on an island that once bent the currents of the world to its will. Long before the maps of Europe bothered to draw accurate coastlines, the name Zanzibar already rang like gold in the ears of merchants from Muscat to Malabar. Arab sailors, steering by stars and monsoon winds, named it Zanzibar, the coast of beauty, or in the fuller phrase they sometimes used, the fair land of the black people. The words tasted of promise. When the dhows rounded Ras Nungwi and the island rose from the horizon, green and low, fringed with white sand that hurt the eyes, even hardened deckhands fell silent. The air itself carried the scent. First salt, then something warmer, sweeter, cloves drying on woven mats, thousands of tons of them, the smell of money. By the 1840s the harbor of Stone Town was a riot of languages. Swahili boatmen shouted to Gujarati moneylenders in broken Hindi. Omani Arabs in crisp white dish dashes haggled with German traders whose pale wrists flashed with new wristwatches. British naval officers, sunburnt and impatient, stepped gingerly over coils of rope while enslaved porters balanced tusks of ivory taller than themselves. Every pier groaned under the weight of commerce. Ivory came down from the interior in endless caravans. Elephants felled near Lake Tanganyika, tusks carried on human shoulders for 6 months through fever swamps and tsetse fly belts, finally reaching the coast where they were weighed, graded, and shipped to carve piano keys in London drawing rooms or bangles for brides in Bombay. Cloves were the real miracle. The Sultan had ordered every landowner to plant 3 trees for every coconut palm, and the island obeyed. From July to October the pickers, mostly enslaved men, women, and children, worked bent double under a sun that felt close enough to touch. The harvested buds, pink at first, were spread on coral rocks to bleach bone white in the heat. When the wind shifted, the whole island seemed to exhale perfume. A single harvest could fill the holds of a dozen baglas bound for Jeddah, Bombay, or Batavia, and the prophet bought guns, silk, and porcelain that came back the other way. Copra, tortoise shell, cowries, rhinoceros horn, nothing was too small or too strange to trade. And beneath the ledgers always the human cargo. The barracoons on the western side of the island stank of despair. Auction blocks stood in the shade of frangipani trees. British cruisers patrolled offshore pretending to suppress the trade while their officers quietly took bribes in ivory and gold. Hypocrisy has always been the lubricant of empire. The man who sat at the center of this web was the Sultan of Zanzibar. His Highness the Sayyid, descendant of the Omani dynasty that had seized the island from the Portuguese in 1698. His palace faced the sea, a wedding cake of a building with verandas wide enough for elephants. From its balconies he could watch customs officers counting duties that made him, for a brief season, one of the richest monarchs on earth. His writ ran not only over the 2 main islands, Unguja and Pemba, but along a fluctuating ribbon of mainland coast 10 miles deep and 1,000 miles long, from the Rovuma River in the south to beyond the Tana in the north. Caravans starting in the Congo Free State paid him tribute before they ever smelled salt. German explorers heading inland needed his firmini, his passport, stamped with the Red Crescent seal, or they risked having their porters melt away at the first rumor of hostility. Yet by the 1880s the world was changing faster than the monsoon. In European chancelleries, men with compasses and pink pencils carved Africa into helpings. The Berlin Conference of 1884–85 turned vague spheres of influence into borders sharp as razors. Britain and Germany, late to the table, scrambled for what remained. Zanzibar, floating just offshore like a jewel on a velvet sea, became the most coveted leftover of all. The British wanted the island to anchor their route to India and to choke German ambitions in East Africa. The Germans wanted it to complete their own coastal chain from Dar es Salaam northward. Both powers courted the aging Sultan Barghash with flattery and gunboats. Both built consulates the size of fortresses on the waterfront, flying enormous flags that snapped day and night like rival dogs barking over a bone. Barghash died in 1888, and the throne began to pass quickly from brother to cousin to nephew, each new ruler more indebted, more frightened, more surrounded by European advisors, who spoke softly and carried treaties already drafted in triplicate. The scent of cloves still drifted across the harbor, but now it mingled with coal smoke from ironclad warships that never seemed to leave. By 1890 the island had become a chess piece too valuable to remain independent. Britain declared a protectorate over the mainland possessions. Germany bought a slice of coast for a few million marks. The Sultan retained his palace, his flag, his harem, and the illusion of sovereignty, little more. Still the world's merchants kept coming. The customs house still overflowed with silver rupees. The call to prayer still rose 5 times a day from 100 minarets, and the muezzins' voices carried over a harbor where dhows with lateen sails rubbed shoulders with steam launches flying the Union Jack or the black-red gold of the Kaiser. No one yet suspected that in a few short years this fragrant, murderous, glittering crossroads would host the shortest war ever recorded. A war decided not by the clash of armies but by the ticking of a clock on a British warship. A war that would begin at 9 in the morning and be finished before the muezzin climbed the minaret for noon prayer. But that is still ahead of us. For now the island drowsed under its perfume of cloves and gunpowder, waiting for the spark. By the last decade of the 19th century, the Royal Navy did not merely sail the oceans. It owned them. Its forest of masts and, increasingly, its forests of funnels had turned the seas into a British lake. From Gibraltar to Singapore, from Halifax to Hong Kong, coaling stations and cable relays flew the same red ensign, and wherever that flag dropped anchor, the world rearranged itself in London's favor. The maxim was simple: trade follows the flag and the flag follows the gun. Zanzibar sat exactly where Britain needed a cork in the bottle. 1,000 miles south of the Suez Canal, 800 miles east of the Great Lakes that were the rumored source of the Nile, the island was the perfect choke point. Whoever held Zanzibar could watch, tax, or block every ship that rounded the Horn of Africa bound for the new German colonies, or for British Uganda, or for the Portuguese ports beyond. More importantly, whoever held Zanzibar could keep a thumb on the windpipe of the entire East African interior. Ivory, rubber, cloves, copra, and everyone quietly understood the still lucrative traffic in human beings, all of it funneled through Stone Town's customs house. Control the island, and you controlled the tap. London watched the Sultan's palace the way a cat watches a mouse. Hole that in the summer of 1890, while most Europeans sweated through an unusually hot season, 2 delegations met in a paneled room on the Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin. The negotiators were cool, almost bored. On one side of the table sat Sir Edward Mallet, Britain's ambassador, precise and mustached. On the other, Herbert von Bismarck, the Chancellor's son, chain-smoking thin cigars. Between them lay maps colored in soft pastel washes, pink for British influence, yellow for German, the colors bleeding into each other like spilled ink. They bargained the way great powers always bargain, with the casual cruelty of men swapping estates they have never visited. Britain offered Germany the windy little North Sea island of Heligoland, strategic for submarines that did not yet exist, but useful for blocking the mouths of the Elbe and the Weser. In exchange, Germany renounced all claims to Zanzibar, to Witu on the mainland, to the steamy coast opposite the island that would soon be renamed Tanganyika. A few additional scraps were thrown in. Britain recognized German rights over distant Togo and Cameroon. Germany conceded British rights over distant Nyasaland. Signatures were appended, seals pressed into red wax, champagne opened. The Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty was hailed in the press as a triumph of diplomacy, a model of European amity. In Zanzibar itself, No one asked the Sultan's opinion. On the 1st of July 1890 the Union Jack rose over a new residency building the size of a battleship, its verandas bristling with telescopes and quick-firing guns. The Sultan, Syed Ali bin Said, was informed that his realm had become a British protectorate. He still had his palace, his ceremonial guard in red fezzes and baggy trousers, his harem, his Friday processions to the mosque. But every important decision now required the countersignature of a British consul general who lived 200 yards away and kept a loaded revolver in his desk drawer. The fiction was elaborate and, to British eyes, comforting. Zanzibar remained independent. The Sultan still issued coins bearing his name and the date in Arabic. His flag, a plain red banner, still flew from the Bait al-Ajaib, the House of Wonders, though now it fluttered beneath a much larger Union Jack on the same pole. British officials spoke piously of advice and guidance. They insisted they had no wish to annex, only to protect. Protection, of course, required warships. 3 or 4 cruisers were always anchored in the roads, their searchlights sweeping the waterfront at night like restless white fingers. The protectorate system was empire in evening dress. No costly occupation armies were needed. A handful of political officers, a company of Sikh or Askari troops, and the looming menace of naval guns were quite enough. The Sultan paid for it all out of his customs revenue. Money that once bought pearl-inlaid doors and Chinese porcelain now paid salaries to British clerks who addressed him, politely but firmly, as Your Highness. While correcting his grammar and treaties he barely understood that in the bazaars. Old Swahili and Indian merchants muttered that the age of the Tao was ending. In the consulate gardens, British ladies in solar tops drank tea and spoke of our Sultan, the way they might speak of a favorite but slightly wayward spaniel. And offshore the grey hulls never left. The stage was set. All that remained was for someone to ignore the new script entirely. On the morning of March 27, 1893, the palace guns fired a slow, dignified 21 rounds over the harbor. Syed Hamad bin Thawani, 38 years old, slight of build, with a neat beard just beginning to gray at the edges, walked barefoot across cool marble to take the oath beneath a canopy of cloth of gold. He looked more like a scholar than a king, soft-spoken, deliberate, eyes that missed nothing yet revealed little. In a court famous for intrigue, poison, and the flash of curved daggers, Hamad's greatest weapon was silenced. He had spent years watching from the sidelines while stronger cousins quarreled and died. He knew every corridor in the palace, every faction among the Arab notables, every Indian moneylender who kept the ledgers that actually ruled the island. When his turn came, he accepted the throne with the air of a man accepting an overdue debt rather than a crown. The British watched the succession with the tense relief of gamblers who have drawn exactly the card they needed. Hamad was everything they wanted in an African ruler. Pliable without seeming weak, modern without being revolutionary, pious without being fanatic. Within weeks of his accession he invited the Consul General Gerald Portal to tea on the upper veranda and listened for 2 hours while Portal explained, gently but unmistakably, how the protectorate would work in practice. Hamad nodded, refilled the Englishman's cup, and asked only that the forms of respect be preserved. Portal left convinced he had met the perfect puppet. Hamad proved more subtle than that he signed every decree the British placed in front of him, yet somehow the slave caravans still slipped through the creeks at night. He allowed Royal Navy boarding parties to search dhows in the harbor, yet the captains always seemed to receive warning an hour in advance. He accepted a British regiment in the old fort, but quietly doubled the pay of his own Zanzibari askaris so that their loyalty remained, in the end, to the man who paid them in Maria Theresa dollars stamped with his own name. He played the long game of a man who understood that the lion does not need to roar when it can simply wait for the hunter to grow tired. In public he was impeccable. At garden parties on the residency lawn he wore European frock coats in the stifling heat and raised a glass of lemonade to the health of Queen Victoria. He sent his sons to be educated in England. He ordered the palace band to learn God Save the Queen, though they played it deliberately half a tone flat. When British missionaries complained about lingering slavery, he issued abolition edicts that looked splendid on paper and were enforced only when a cruiser happened to be in sight. For 3 years the arrangement held like a held breath. Merchants prospered. The clove crop was good. The harbor stayed calm. Hamad rose early, prayed at dawn, inspected the customs house himself, and spent evenings on the rooftop listening to poetry recited by an old blind man who had once served his grandfather. Visitors remarked that the Sultan seemed almost content, as though he had discovered the narrow path between survival and dignity and intended to walk it to the end. Then, on the morning of Tuesday, August 25, 1896, the palace woke to silence. Hamad had taken breakfast as usual on the seaward balcony. Coffee, dates, a little bread. He complained of feeling tired, went inside to rest, and within an hour was dead. The court physician, a nervous Greek in British employ, signed a certificate that mentioned acute dysentery. The body was washed, shrouded, and buried before sunset, as Islamic law demands. By nightfall the bazaars were buzzing. No one believed the official story. Dysentery does not kill a healthy man in 60 minutes. The timing was too convenient. Hamad had been negotiating quietly to reduce the British subsidy paid to his cousin Khalid bin Barghash, a young hothead who hated everything the Protectorate stood for. Hamad had also refused to ratify a new concession granting the British rights to build a railway from the coast to Lake Victoria. Rights London wanted very badly. In the narrow lanes behind the House of Wonders, men spoke in lowered voices, poison in the coffee. An English doctor was seen leaving by the back gate. No, it was Khalid, he wants the throne. Or the Germans, they still dream of Zanzibar. No proof ever surfaced. The British ordered an inquiry, then quietly buried its findings. Khalid bin Barghash, 24 years old, handsome, reckless, and burning with resentment, moved his belongings into the palace that same night. Armed retainers, several hundred Baluchi mercenaries and palace slaves, began sharpening swords in the courtyards. Across the water, in the British consulate, Basil Cave, the acting consul general, poured himself a large whiskey and began drafting urgent telegrams to London and to the senior naval officer on the East Africa station. The held breath had been released. Now the storm could begin. The sun had not yet set on the day of Hamad's burial when the palace drums began to beat a different rhythm. Faster, urgent, almost defiant. Khalid bin Barghash was 24, tall, broad-shouldered, with the easy arrogance of a man who had spent his life being told he should have been born first. Exiled to the fringes of the court by Hamad's careful diplomacy, he had nursed his resentment like a hidden wound. He kept a circle of young Arab nobles who drank French brandy and spoke of driving the infidels into the sea. He owned a magnificent chestnut stallion he rode bareback through the streets at dawn, scattering chickens and children. He had a personal guard of 300 Baluchi mercenaries, dark, scarred men who wore crimson sashes and carried tulwars sharpened on both edges. Everyone knew Khalid believed the throne had been stolen from him by British smiles and poisoned coffee. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, while the town still reeked of camphor from Hamad's funeral, Khalid rode through the palace gates at a gallop. Behind him marched his Baluchis, boots ringing on the coral stone, muskets slung, and behind them came ox carts loaded with rosewood chests full of silver rupees, gifts for anyone who would shout his name. The palace eunuchs, men who had served 3 sultans and seen a dozen plots, took one look at the determined face under the gold-fringed turban and stepped aside. By sunset the red flag of the dynasty was flying from every mast, not the small banner of a morning court, but the full-sized battle standard, 30 feet long, snapping like a whip in the evening breeze. Slaves hammered brass cannons, relics of the Portuguese era, green with verdigris, into place along the seaward wall. The palace armory, long padlocked on British orders, was broken open. Ancient matchlocks, boarding pikes, and a beautiful but cranky little brass yacht gun that had once belonged to Tipu Tip were dragged into the courtyard and loaded with anything that would fit: nails, broken glass, chain links. At 8 o'clock, under flickering torchlight, Khalid climbed the wooden staircase to the top floor of the Bait al-Hukm and proclaimed himself Sayyid Khalid bin Barghash, Sultan of Zanzibar and all his dependencies. Courtiers who hesitated were prodded forward by Baluchi bayonets. Those who cheered loudest were handed bags of silver. The palace band, still wearing the black armbands of mourning, was ordered to strike up a marching tune. They played so enthusiastically that one of the elderly drummers collapsed and had to be carried away. Across the narrow creek that separated the palace from the European quarter, the windows of the British consulate blazed with sudden lamplight. Basil Cave, the acting consul, stood on his balcony in shirt sleeves, telescope to his eye, watching the red flag climb higher and higher. He did not need to count the cannons. He had memorized their positions years ago. What he saw instead were hundreds of armed men pouring into the palace compound, shutters slamming shut, lanterns extinguished one by one until the entire waterfront palace became a single glowing fortress. Cave sent an urgent note by launch to the senior naval officer Rear Admiral Harry Rawson, whose flagship HMS St. George lay at Dar es Salaam, 2 days steaming to the south. The note was short: Khalid has seized the palace by force. Proclaims himself Sultan. Requests immediate instructions. Then he sent a polite letter across the creek to Khalid himself, delivered by a trembling palace major domo. It reminded the new Sultan that, under the terms of the protectorate, no succession was valid without British consent, and requested that he present himself at the consulate the following morning to discuss the situation, in a spirit of amity. Khalid read the letter aloud to his followers, laughed, tore it into 4 pieces and fed it to the brazier. He then ordered the palace gates chained and posted double sentries with orders to fire on any European who approached after dark. In the bazaar the news spread faster than Harmattan wind. Some cheered the young Arab who had defied the foreigners. Others, especially the Indian traders who depended on British protection, shuttered their shops and began packing. Old women muttered that the palace was now full of angry ghosts who disliked loud music. Children ran alongside the walls shouting, "Long live Sultan Khalid," until their mothers dragged them indoors. At 2 in the morning Khalid walked the battlements himself, barefoot, a curved jambia stuck in his silk belt, staring out at the dark water where the riding lights of 2 British cruisers, HMS Philomel and HMS Sparrow, glimmered like watchful eyes. He is reported to have said, in a voice loud enough for the sentries to hear, "They will not dare. Not while I hold the palace." Behind him, the palace harem, newly inherited and still confused, began to wail in mourning for the dead Hamad and in fear of what tomorrow might bring. Across the harbor, on the quarterdeck of HMS Raccoon, the duty officer quietly ordered the ship's boilers lit and the 4.7-inch guns loaded with common shell. The clock had started ticking. Basil Cave had not slept. All night he paced the consulate roof, coat unbuttoned in the humid air, watching the palace windows glow like a hive of angry bees. In his hand he turned over the same telegram form again and again until the paper went soft. He had spent 5 years on the island coaxing, threatening, and bribing sultans into obedience. He was not about to let a 24-year-old peacock undo it in a single afternoon. Khalid bin Barghash was everything the Foreign Office feared: proud, pro-slavery in private, and openly contemptuous of the advice that came with British protection. Cave had files thick with intercepted letters. Khalid writing to Arab notables promising to reopen the inland slave routes once the Europeans looked away. Khalid boasting he would tear down the English church and build a new barracoon in its place. To Cave, this was not just rebellion. It was heresy against the civilizing mission he told himself he served. At dawn on August 26 he drafted the ultimatum himself, pen scratching across heavy consular paper. To His Highness Sayyid Khalid bin Barghash, you have unlawfully seized the palace and proclaimed yourself Sultan without the consent of Her Britannic Majesty's government, in direct violation of the Treaty of Protection. You are hereby required to haul down your flag, quit the palace with your armed followers, and present yourself at the consulate before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, August 27. Failing compliance, Forceful measures will be taken to enforce the lawful succession. God save the Queen. He signed it with a flourish, blotted the ink, and handed it to a Zanzibari messenger who crossed the creek under a white flag. The man came back an hour later, pale and sweating, with Khalid's reply spoken aloud for anyone in the palace yard to hear: "Tell the Englishman that if he wants the palace, he must come and take it." Cave did not shout. He simply walked to the telegraph office and sent 2 words to Admiral Rawson on HMS St. George: "Execute plan." For the next 36 hours Stone Town held its breath and listened to the sound of men preparing to die. Inside the palace compound Khalid worked like a man possessed. Every able-bodied male was pressed into service. Baluchi mercenaries in crimson jackets, Swahili askaris in faded red fezzes, palace eunuchs who had never held anything heavier than a fly whisk, even the kitchen boys and harem gardeners. By nightfall he claimed nearly 3,000 defenders, though half had no idea which end of a musket fired. They dragged 17 cannons into position, brass 6-pounders cast in Muscat a century earlier, one ridiculous 32-pounder that had cracked its carriage years ago and now sat drunkenly on a pile of coral blocks. Powder was short, shot was shorter. Gunners stuffed the muzzles with musket balls, rusty nails, and broken crockery. The palace flag flew higher than ever, blood red against a sky turning the color of brass. Across the narrow harbor the Royal Navy assembled with the calm efficiency of men who had done this before. HMS St. George, first-rate cruiser, 4.7-inch quick-firers fore and aft. HMS Philomel and HMS Raccoon, their decks cleared for action. 2 smaller gunboats, Thrush and Sparrow, nimble enough to work in close. 400 Royal Marines and bluejackets landed at dawn, white pith helmets gleaming, Lee Metford rifles slung, Maxim guns on wheeled carriages dragged ashore by sailors singing Hearts of Oak. They took up positions along the seafront, behind the Customs House wall, on the flat roof of the English Club, in the shady graveyard of the Anglican Church where the tombstones of earlier consuls looked on in silence. At 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the 26th, Basil Cave walked down to the shore under a large white parasol, accompanied by the captains of every warship. They stood in a neat semicircle while a bugler sounded the call. Cave read the final warning aloud, voice carrying across the water to the palace windows: "Surrender by 9 tomorrow or the palace will be reduced." A single cannon shot answered from the palace roof, wild, high, splashing harmlessly half a mile out to sea. The British officers did not even flinch. They simply turned on their heels and walked back to their ships. That night the town shut itself tight. Ironwood doors were barred, windows shuttered with teak planks, mothers pulled children from the streets. In the Indian bazaar the money changers buried their silver in back gardens. In the Arab quarter old men prayed for deliverance. Young men sharpened knives and waited for a war they did not understand. On the palace roof Khalid walked the parapets again, barefoot, eyes bloodshot, promising his followers that the Germans would come, that the Americans would protest, that the British would never dare fire on a sovereign palace in broad daylight. Behind him, in the harem, the women had begun the low, continuous keen of mourning, as though the Sultan were already dead. Thursday, August 27, 1896, broke hot and still. The sun rose behind the palace, turning its white walls the color of bone. Across the water the Union Jack hung limp on every mast. Not a breath of wind stirred the palm fronds. The only sounds were gulls, the lap of tide against coral, and the nervous coughing of men waiting to kill or be killed. At 8 o'clock the ship's bells rang the hour. Marines stood to attention along the waterfront, rifles at the ready. On the palace roof the red flag still flew, defiant, but fewer heads now showed above the parapet. At 8:40 a.m. launch flying the white ensign crossed the harbor one last time. A midshipman no older than Khalid himself stood in the bow and shouted the final offer of safe passage for anyone who left before 9. A single musket shot was the only reply. The ball clipped the launch's flagstaff and splintered wood. The midshipman sat down abruptly, pale but unhurt. The launch turned and rowed back. At 8:55 Basil Cave climbed the signal tower of the consulate. He carried no watch. He simply looked at the church clock visible across the rooftops and waited. At 9 o'clock exactly the minute hand clicked upright. Nothing happened for a long, terrible moment. Then at 9:02, Cave lowered his arm from the upper deck of HMS St. George. A single red pennant broke out and whipped upward. A second later the first gun spoke, a sharp, violent crack that rolled across the water like a slap. The shell struck the palace roof, exploded in a blossom of red dust and teak splinters, and tore the great red flag from its staff. It fluttered down like a dying bird. Before the echo died the entire squadron opened fire. The shortest war in history had begun. At 9:02 the sky cracked open. St. George's forward 4.7-inch gun fired first. The shell screamed across the water and punched through the palace roof in a shower of teak and coral dust. A heartbeat later every British ship joined the chorus. Philomel, Raccoon, Thrush, Sparrow, more than 40 guns hammering in disciplined sequence. The palace walls, thick as they were, had never been built to withstand high explosive lyddite. They crumpled like dry sand. By 9:06 the Zanzibari artillery was silent. Brass cannons lay on their sides, barrels split, gunners torn apart beside them. The great red flag was gone, only a smoking pole remained, flames leapt from the harem wing. The beautiful latticed balconies that had watched 100 monsoons collapsed inward, taking screaming women and children with them. Shells walked methodically through the compound. The clock tower, the lighthouse, the Sultan's private mosque, each struck and obliterated within seconds. Out in the harbor the royal yacht HHS Glasgow, a pretty white steamer Khalid had proudly renamed after a gift from Scotland, tried to enter the fight. Her ancient 9-pounders barked once. The shots fell so short they barely wet the bows of the nearest British cruiser. A single answering shell from Raccoon struck her boiler. Steam and fire erupted together. She rolled, showed her copper bottom and was gone, leaving only a swirl of oil and broken deck chairs. By 9:15 the palace was a furnace. Black smoke poured upward, carrying the smell of burning cloves, silk and human hair. Survivors streamed out of side gates, some still clutching useless muskets, others barefoot in nightshirts, stumbling over bodies in the narrow lanes. At 9:40 a.m. torn bedsheet appeared on a spear above the ruins. Someone was waving it desperately. The guns fell silent. The war had lasted 38 minutes. Khalid bin Barghash escaped through a hidden door behind the harem, face blackened with soot, turban gone, running in borrowed servants' clothes. He reached the German consulate half a mile away, pounded on the gates, and was pulled inside just as British Marines came into view. Berlin refused extradition. 11 days later, under cover of darkness, a German gunboat slipped him aboard and carried him south to Dar es Salaam. He would live another 31 years in exile, dying forgotten in Mombasa in 1927. That same afternoon the Union Jack rose over the smoldering palace. Hamid bin Muhammad, quiet, cooperative, and already waiting in the wings, was proclaimed Sultan before the embers cooled. He signed whatever was put in front of him. Full protectorate status, total abolition of the slave trade, British troops in permanent residence. 500 Zanzibaris lay dead or dying among the ruins. Many were palace servants and women caught in the crossfire. On the British side a single petty officer suffered a shrapnel graze to the arm while drinking tea on deck. The message was received loud and clear. 38 minutes was all it took to prove that sovereignty, in the age of iron and steam, existed only at the pleasure of those who controlled the sea. A palace reduced to rubble, a dynasty scattered, an island's future mortgaged. All before the morning tea had cooled. It remains the shortest war ever fought, yet its echo was long. Zanzibar would not breathe free air again until December 1963. 38 minutes. Less time than it takes to watch a single act of a play. Yet in that brief, brutal interval an ancient sultanate died, and the modern colonial world announced in fire and steel that it had arrived for good. Some wars are measured in years and millions of dead. Some need only minutes and the right guns pointed at the right palace. On August 27, 1896, the world learned both lessons at once.